Hello to you hackers and non-hackers alike. Welcome to my talk where I will be discussing fission cases and personal identity. But before that, I just want to say hi. My name is Rach, and if you do not know me, I graduated my Masters in Philosophy at the University of York in 2019, and at the moment I am studying at the University of Oxford, getting a teacher training degree in religious education. So, what am I doing in this talk? There are three things I will be exploring throughout this talk. First of all, I'm looking at the psychological continuity account of personal identity. I will be going through who were the major contributors when it comes to this approach, namely John Locke, who came up with the memory criterion, and Sidney Shoemaker, who improved it and got rid of the objection of transitivity. I will then be looking at fission cases and why they are a problem for the psychological continuity account of personal identity, and this is mainly due to it provides logical contradictions when this is applied for experiments. And lastly, I'll be looking at ways to overcome these logical contradictions, so whether or not we can find a plausible way to still use the account of psychological continuity for defining how a person persists through time, or if we should just give it up altogether. For this section, I'll be primarily looking at the work of Derek Parfit and David Lewis and his account of the multi-occupant view. So before we begin, I should probably explain what I mean by the persistence question, because in the philosophy topic of personal identity, we have two main questions. We have what is a person? What makes me a person? What makes an alien a person? What makes you a person? Are you a person? That's a deep philosophical question to ask yourself, but we're not focusing on that side of the personal identity debate today. We are focusing on how a person persists through time, and by this I mean if, say, T1 is you in the present and T2 is either you in the past or you in the future, we're trying to solve this formula. If X is a human person at T1 and Y is another person at T2, X equals Y if and only if we are trying to come up with the end of that formula. What makes you in the present the same as you in the past or you in the future? And there are many ways to look at this view. You can go for the materialist or physical approach, which is I am my body. This is my flesh machine. This flesh machine is who I am. You go with an immortal soul approach, where you are some sort of non-physical soul-like being that is immortal. You can go with the very cynical approach that you are not the same person. You're completely different in every way. Or you can go with the very modern, most popular approach, which is psychological continuity. You are your consciousness, your thoughts, your memories, everything you think, every thought, every feeling, that makes you you. So the psychological continuity account, this was first developed by John Locke in his book An Essay Concerning Human Understanding. He referred to this as the memory criterion because he concluded that it was our memories that makes us the same person we were yesterday and the person we are tomorrow. So he had a wonderful quote here saying, like, so Locke identified the self as that conscious thinking thing which is capable of happiness or misery, and so is concerned for itself as far as that consciousness extends. And in the same section, Locke argues that the self depends on consciousness, not substance. By this, he's breaking away from that materialist idea that we are just physical beings. He is saying that we are not defined by our flesh, we are defined by our conscious thought. And by conscious thought, he specifically looked at memories. Locke's memory criterion was quite revolutionary for its time because it was very intuitive in that I like to think all the thoughts and memories from my past is why I am the person I am today, and the stuff I think and like feel and do now will shape the person I am in the future. That's quite an intuitive thought, that without your memories, without your conscious thinking, you are not you. and is like a very intriguing thought. And we can sum up Locke's theory by stating that if a person who exists at T2 is the same as a person existing at an earlier time, T1, we can say the reason for this is because that person at T2 remembers the actions and experiences that occurred at T1. The problem is Locke's memory criterion is quite outdated. There are a lot of arguments as to why this idea doesn't really work, and the most famous one is Reid's problem of transitivity. Now, by transitivity I simply mean if A equals B and B equals C, surely A must equal C, or vice versa. However, this does not work when it comes to psychological continuity. Reid gave a good example of the boy, soldier and officer, 3 stages of a person's life. So here are our same person but 3 stages of his life. We've got the boy, the officer and the soldier and the officer. So it would be the case that the soldier remembers being the boy and the officer remembers being the soldier. However, the officer, because in his old age he has forgotten about being the boy. He does not have any memories anymore of being the boy. So we've got B equals A and C equals B, but we do not have that C equaling that A, or vice versa, which is a problem because it means that this psychological continuity approach is not transitive. So how can the boy and the officer be the same person if the officer does not remember being the boy? This is why I want to bring in the work of Sidney Shoemaker, who argues, well, you can get around this idea by using his idea of memory chains. So by memory chains, Shoemaker is referring to the idea that what this account makes necessary for identity with its past self is not that one remembers the actions and experiences of that past self, but one having memory continuity with that past self. Memory continuity consisting in the occurrence of change of memory connected person stages of the sort. So his idea, put briefly, is that you can still have psychological continuity between the boy, soldier and officer because you have what is called a memory chain. You've got the officer remembering being the soldier and the soldier remembering being the boy. This is a memory chain because you remember a point where you did remember being that boy, if that makes sense. So as long as you have that chain of connected memories, you can still argue that you're still psychologically continuous because you remember a time you did remember when you were really young. And so your life is still that long chain of conscious thoughts. You are still defined by your thoughts, memories, consciousness. So where does that leave us in terms of what definition we are using for the term psychological continuity? So we're putting psychological continuity to the side for now. We're gonna push it back, put a pin in it, and then come back to it later, as I want to give a brief introduction to fission cases and how they relate to personal identity and the psychological continuity account and why it's a problem. So fission, as you might remember from science, is the act of splitting or dividing something into 2 or more parts. So when applying this to our topic about consciousness, about our brains, we're describing fission cases as splitting the brain in half. More specifically, if we want to get biological up in here, in split brain cases, it is the cerebrum, the thing in your brain, that gets divided. This is important because the cerebrum is responsible for our senses, our thoughts and our movements. It has a massive role in determining our mental features, thus it plays a big part to our consciousness and psychological continuity. Let's tell a story of our friend Jerome. Now Jerome, he was feeling bored one day, so he decided to split his brain in half, and each half is put then into 2 brainless bodies. So the doctor splits his brain in half, and it by miracle works. Jerome's brain is now divided into 2 separate bodies, who we will call lefty and righty. Now, both lefty and righty have all of Jerome's memories and other mental features. Both lefty and righty has inherited Jerome's mental features. They have all his memories, all his thoughts, all his feelings, all his consciousness is in both of these bodies, and they're both functioning as if they were the original Jerome. There are a few ways we can look at this. We have three options of what's happened. If we have both lefty and righty, and if we're following psychological continuity, we can only draw three conclusions. Either Jerome is both lefty and righty, because he has both lefty and righty has inherited those mental features, or only one of those lefty and righty is Jerome, or none of them is Jerome and Jerome is dead, which is quite a depressing view when you look at it. But each of these three options is problematic in some way. So what are the problems that occur with each of these? Now, if we say Jerome is neither lefty and righty, then we can't say that we are psychologically continuous, because lefty and righty both inherited Jerome's mental features. Thus, according to psychological continuity, they are Jerome. However, if we say Jerome's the left one or Jerome's the right one, but not both, that is too ambiguous. Why would he be one but not the other? So here, if we want to save psychological continuity, we have to conclude the first option, that Jerome is both lefty and righty. Both of these beings are Jerome. But this leads to really weird and wacky problems and contradictions, because that's like saying if lefty is thirsty and righty isn't, you could then form the statement Jerome is thirsty, Jerome is not thirsty, which brings a logical contradiction, because you can't be both thirsty and not thirsty. So here's a problem, because it provides logical contradictions and it goes against what we think numerical identity is. The common sense view of identity is that there is one of you and that's it. And I know I'm not good at maths, but I'm pretty sure 1 does not equal 2. So it is a very weird case, but it's the only conclusion we can draw if we want to save the idea of psychological continuity. So what I want to talk about for this last bit of the talk is, can we reconcile this? Because it's just a bit weird, if we're being very honest. And to do this, I'll be looking at the work of Derek Parfit and David Lewis. So first, let's look at Parfit's way of getting around this. So Derek Parfit gave an example of how it is plausible for someone to be both lefty and righty. He gave this analogy, which, trigger warning, includes maths. Say Jerome is in a maths exam and he gets to the last question. It turns out that Jerome has 2 methods he could use to solve the problem, but he does not know which one is best. Now imagine Jerome has this magical power to disconnect a hemisphere of his brain at will. This means he is able to split his brain, getting one half lefty to solve the math problem with one method and the other half righty to solve the math problem with the alternative method. After he solves the problem, Jerome reconnects his brain and both solutions are in his memory. So the question is, are lefty and righty both Jerome in this case? And I guess it depends on what Jerome was experiencing during the split. Now, according to Parfit, Jerome would have experienced only one of these 2 streams of consciousness, i.e. he would have been able to experience what one half of the brain was experiencing but not the other. He would have been completely unaware of what the other half was doing. However, since Jerome would have had access to one side of 2 halves, it would follow that Jerome was either lefty or righty, but as previously stated, this doesn't seem possible because it's too arbitrary. It just doesn't make sense. This is probably why Parfit went on to conclude that after the 2 halves were reunited, Jerome could suddenly remember solving the maths questions, Jerome could remember solving the maths questions, both ways. His brain reconnected and he had the experiences of both lefty and righty. Now, this would mean Jerome is both lefty and righty in this situation because post-reunion he is psychologically continuous with both halves of the brain. It involves two series of thought, but they were both Jerome's. However, this thought experiment is very interesting, but only goes so far. Even Parfit himself acknowledged that this example can only do so much, as it involves reuniting both lefty and righty. It's one thing to talk about split brain cases where the brain is split is not permanent, but it's another thing to discuss what would happen if the brain split was permanent. So Parfit concludes, when it comes to fission cases, if the split brain is permanent, then fission means death. Parfit concludes that if the split brain is permanent and you are lefty and righty forever, you are dead. You are no longer you. Even though you're psychologically continuous with the person you were for in both cases, they can't both be you. Parfit is a strong believer in numerical identity. There is only one of you, and when there's suddenly two, you no longer exist. Parfit makes quite a profound conclusion by saying identity shouldn't matter, and the only thing that does matter is survival. So it doesn't matter how you persist through time. The only thing that matters is you do persist through time, because that's the important part. Your life, your experience, that's what's important part. Parfit says that we're going through time. Yes, it's confusing. We don't know how, but we're here. Let's enjoy it whilst we can. Parfit's thought experience is intriguing, but it doesn't really give a satisfying answer for how we could survive as both lefty and righty. So this is why I want to look at David Lewis, because his idea of multi-occupant view helps save the psychological continuity account, as it makes a plausible argument as to what actually happens when you are both lefty and righty. So what did Lewis actually say? Lewis talked about the multi-occupancy view of personal identity, which essentially means there can be multiple persons that are you. So this fission case is right up Lewis's street, because he says, yes, you are both lefty and righty, and yes, it does make sense. But does it? This view is usually combined with the general metaphysical claim that people and other persisting things are made up of temporal parts. So not only are we made up of flesh and bones, we are made up of temporal parts, which of course temporal means time. This is a four-dimensionalist view, which means an object or persisting thing, as quoted by Lewis, extends through the fourth dimension, time, as well as space. So a person extends in time, and this is because they are made up of temporal parts, which are parts of the persisting objects that exist through time. So we are made up of wibbly wobbly, timey-wimey stuff, if you want to be very technical here. When applying this to fission cases, the way people typically view a typical fission case is that one person is split into two, and we end up with two little faces, two distinct results. However, according to Lewis, in fission cases, once again I quote, by describing fission as initial stage sharing, we provide for the two but not for the one. There were two all along. By this, he means that those two people, lefty and righty, were simply sharing temporal parts whilst they were Jerome. They were always going to be two people, but it just so happened their temporal parts overlapped through this time. This implies that fission is not a case of splitting at all, merely separating. Lewis argues that if there is X amount of fission in your future, then there's X amount of you even now. So for example, if in the future I was split into lefty and righty, I am both lefty and righty at this very moment. I just am unaware of that fact, which means you're two people or more people, like depending on how many splits you have, post-fission, but also pre-fission. If fission is in my future, I am that many people right now. I am just sharing temporal parts with each of those people. Now, crazy as this sounds, this allows for psychological continuity, as both lefty and righty are different people, but they share the same temporal parts, explaining why they have identical mental features. We can still say that Jerome is a human person at a certain time, T1, and lefty and righty exists at another time, T2, and we can say that Jerome is equal to lefty / righty if and only if lefty and righty has inherited the mental features from Jerome. However, the question on my mind is this plausible by saying that there are two people rather than one, especially since, according to Lewis, we cannot tell whether or not we are two people. Like, as I was saying, I could be two people, but I do not know. The fact you do not know is quite a weird claim. I feel like one person, but apparently I might be two if there's fission in my future, and that is a bit not very intuitive, if you ask me. What Lewis is referring to is overlapping in temporal parts, where you just share time with each other, and like, a clear way of understanding this lapping is to think about two roads. He gave an example of a diversion train track. We overlap as the track goes on, but eventually the track splits into two or more pieces. And that's what he's kind of saying. We are overlapping temporal parts, but then we split off and go our own temporal direction. So applying this to fission cases, when lefty and righty are overlapping, i.e. sharing parts, they appear as if they are one person, but in reality, they're actually two. Although this doesn't work for the idea of numerical identity, it does in terms of tense identity, and by tense I mean time. Applying Lewis's theory back to psychological continuity and whether fission cases pose an issue, it appears that Lewis's account does provide a way to show that Jerome could be lefty and righty. They simply share temporal parts. Lewis's theory can combine with psychological continuity approach. It just means editing our view of what a person is. It just means saying that we are made up of temporal parts as well as all the other stuff that makes us us. This should not affect how we view people positioned through time. So linking back to our contradiction where we say Jerome is both thirsty and not thirsty, we can get around that by saying, well, Jerome is quite an ambiguous term, because if Lewis's view kind of makes names ambiguous, because if you're Jerome but suddenly you're lefty and righty are fine. What's fine is the initial name Jerome, because that was just a name. It's ambiguous because it's a name for two people combined into one. So it would just simply be wrong to say Jerome is and is not thirsty, because we're not referring to Jerome, we are referring to both lefty and righty, who are two people rather than one. It would make more sense, so rather than saying both lefty and righty are Jerome, it would make more sense to say Jerome is both lefty and righty. I admit this sparks questions of whether people are made up of temporal parts, but I would say for like whether or not you believe we are made up of time parts and temporal parts, it's an interesting debate, but for another day. I would bite the bullet with Lewis and say his ideas are confusing, and I have a few choice words about them, and like, it's a bit hard to get your head around, to be honest, thinking 1 equals 2, because it's just numerically it doesn't make sense. But if we're biting the bullet, it does give a plausible way of avoiding problems fission cases present to psychological community, and shows how the view is at the very least like plausible. There is a way to vend psychological continuity and fission cases. There are other ways, but David Lewis's is definitely one of the most popular and the most weird and wonderful, I guess. So I guess that's my talk. Overall, I have explained the problem of fission cases and how it affects the psychological continuity view of the persistence question, and I've discussed 2 outcomes, so Parfit and Lewis, and kind of suggest a plausible way of how you could get over these problems by saying humans are made up of temporal parts. I hope you've enjoyed this talk. If you would like to talk philosophy with me further, please drop me a message, ping me on Slack, or just write me an email, and I would love to hear your thoughts. Obviously this was a very whirlwind talk about personal identity, and there is so much more to cover, so do let me know if you want to hear more on this, and ask me any questions in the Q&A later on. Thank you very much. I have enjoyed talking to you. I hope you have enjoyed listening, and I will see you guys around.